delicious. Even before the Industrial Revolution, wealthy trading nations dreamed of connecting the world's two largest bodies of water, the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. Prior to the arrival of Europeans in America, trade generally followed ancient routes with some evolutions over the years, but an east to west flow of trade was dominant, with spices, teas, valuable metals and gemstones, all making their way along the Silk Road and other historic routes from Asia through to Europe. Then, in the era of colonial expansion, with the British, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Dutch all spreading their wings to conquer as much of the known world as possible, new trade routes emerged. Africa, North America, South America, and eventually Oceania, with Australia, first known as New Holland, and New Zealand, the last landmass on Earth to be found by the West. But once America's economic might had begun to grow, the independent United States of America had asserted itself as a dominant world power, and trade was no longer centered solely around getting goods to Europe. Suddenly, there was a new buyer in the market, and some of those buyers lived on the West Coast. Well, the West Coast, as you'll no doubt be aware, is pretty far away from the East Coast. It can take about 6 days to drive a modern car coast to coast. Or alternatively, instead of driving or perhaps riding horseback, 3,000 miles. That's, by the way, that's the sailing distance from the English Channel to the east coast of America. You could maybe take a ship, just like many 49ers did back in 1849. The Edward Everett was the very first ship to sail from Boston on exactly that journey, bound for California. 15,000-mile journey that took it all the way south to the tip of South America at Cape Horn. Storms and rough seas were par for the course. Oh. Oh. The weather south of the equator wasn't kind to those 49ers, especially around the turbulent end of the world at Cape Horn. But the dream of the gold that they might find in the Wild West was usually enough to keep them committed to the up to 8-month journey. But oh, wouldn't it be so much easier if there was a cut-through? Surely a canal from the Atlantic to the Pacific would benefit everyone. Well, that's what the Spanish thought. That's what the French thought, and the British, and the Americans, and the Nicaraguans, and the Panamanians. Not that they existed quite yet. Panama was controlled by Colombia, but America would soon see to that. Let's go back to before the beginning. We're going to discover the story of the Panama Canal from first seeds to the monumental feat of human engineering that it is today. We'll track the route that we're going to be sailing this cruise, and we'll also look at the routes that didn't make it, or haven't yet made it. And to round up, I want to share with you one of the most inspiring stories to come out of the Panama Canal in its 111 years so far. Then, when we go through the canal, I'd like you to please keep an eye on things for an A to Z of the canal. And afterwards, we're going to get back in here alongside the captain. We're going to show you our video of our transit through the canal. The captain will narrate and tell you what he was doing at different times, and then we're going to try and complete a dictionary of the Panama Canal together. So that's your challenge. Alrighty. The Panama Canal was completed in August of 1914, but the dream of an east-west canal in Central America had been simmering since the early 19th century. At the time, Spain was the dominant colonial power in Central America, and in 1819, the Spanish government authorized the construction of a canal through the region. Not that very much work got underway. Beyond the setting up of a company to run the project, nothing else came from the Spanish efforts to build an interoceanic canal. So in the 1850s, the British and Americans joined together on a shared mission to build the first canal stretching between the Atlantic and the Pacific, in Nicaragua, significantly closer to the southern shores of the USA than Panama, and again, beyond some intricately negotiated bilateral treaties and a round of topographical surveying, nothing really got off the ground. But inspired by their successful completion of the Suez Canal in 1869, the Geographical Society of Paris became interested in the idea, and they bought the development rights to construct a canal across the Isthmus of Panama from ruling Colombia via a limited company called La Société Civile Internationale du Canal Interoceanique de Darien. Short name. Much to the British disdain at the time, the French had already proved themselves as master canal creators. The Suez Canal, which the British had opposed, was a tremendous success. And La France was back again to tame the sea and sculpt another cash cow of a trade path through another continent. Now, here's what happened next. French explorations of the region, seeking out an optimal canal route, began in 1876, led in Paris by a man called Ferdinand de Lesseps, and in the Isthmus by French Navy Lieutenant Lucien Wise. Wise brought back a series of potential options to Paris, all of which were rejected because they required tunnels or locks to make the canal dream come true. De Lesseps, the statesman at the helm of the Suez Canal project, wanted to recreate his success of a sea-level canal. No locks, no tunnels, just move some sand out of the way and let the boats through for a petit fee. Of course, Central America is geologically quite distinct from Africa's sandscapes. But sent back to reconsider, Wise stumbled upon a route from Limon Bay to Panama City, which he thought, with a bit of committed digging, could offer a sea-level crossing between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. And even though he didn't conceive of using the locks that we know are now a part of the Panama Canal today, Wise's Limon Bay to Panama City route is largely reflected in the journey that we're going to be taking in a couple of days' time. With the blessing of the Société in Paris, Wise traveled to Bogota to negotiate a treaty with the Colombian government. And a treaty known as the Wise Concession was drafted and signed on March the 20th, 1878, giving the French Société Civile the exclusive right to build an interoceanic canal through Panama on the proviso that after 99 years, ownership of the waterway would revert to the government of Colombia with no compensation due. Pretty savvy negotiating. If only the Société had been as effective at building the canal as they had been in negotiating for the right to try. Because, as you might have already suspected, constructing the Panama Canal was going to prove a tad more complicated than the Suez. I don't want to say that they'd had beginner's luck in their first continental cut-through, but if it were luck, it was soon to run out. Anyway, back to the drawing board and what happened next. The French have their shiny new right to an interoceanic canal, a good idea of a route, and some money in the bank to steamroll the project. So they did what any sensible, considered group of pensive pioneers would do, and they planned a conference in Paris to take further proposals of routes. And a total of 14 proposals for sea-level canals were presented to the International Congress for the Study of an Interoceanic Canal, which a subcommittee then whittled down to 2 finalists. One route through Panama, the other route through Nicaragua. If decisions had leant the other way back on May the 15th, 1879, we'd be embarking on a cruise through the Nicaragua Canal. And that's what the American delegation wanted, for obvious reasons of proximity to their own shores. But de Lesseps of the Geographical Society prevailed, and the committee's eventual resolution read as follows. The Congress believes that the excavation of an interoceanic canal at sea level, so desirable in the interests of commerce and navigation, is feasible, and that in order to take advantage of the indispensable facilities for access and operation which a channel of this kind must offer above all, this canal should extend from the Gulf of Limon to the Bay of Panama. The decision was made. Whether it was a good one was yet to be seen. And whilst not a unanimous decision, it certainly was a decisive one, with 74 in favour and only 8 in opposition, including, by the way, a 47-year-old Alexandre Gustave Eiffel, who was 8 years away from breaking ground on his monumental tower, the Eiffel Tower. Of the 74 yay votes, only 19 were engineers with any actual qualification in the subject matter, and only 1 had ever visited Central America. Such was the colonial spirit of the age, an enthusiastic shot in the dark. Now, the period of French construction was marked by a noteworthy number of champagne receptions, a few significant breakthroughs, and an unfortunate series of untimely deaths, which ultimately took the wind out of the sails of the French mission and the eventual succession of the project by the USA. In total, 25,000 workers lost their lives during the construction of the Panama Canal. Now, to put that into some perspective, during the construction of the Empire State Building in New York, with no harnesses or hard hats in sight, 5 workers died. When Gustave Eiffel erected his tower in Paris, 1 worker died. Building the Panama Canal was dangerous business. That said, to give the canal builders some credit, the construction of the Panama Canal was far less deadly than the 11-year excavation of the Suez Canal. That resulted in 120,000 people, mainly forced laborers, losing their lives. But back to the Panama Canal. One particular story that became something of a local legend was the sorry case of Henri Bion. Bion was a well-educated Frenchman. He had degrees in medicine and law, as well as in-depth knowledge on international finance. And he'd been sent to Gamboa to inspect progress on behalf of de Lesseps, who, despite a huge amount of charisma and leadership prowess, actually had very little practical knowledge about engineering or canals. Unbeknownst to Bion, he arrived in the middle of a yellow fever outbreak, which was sweeping unforgivably through the 1,039 workers. Well, several of the engineers had arranged a dinner in honor of his arrival. Bion was the last to arrive, entering the hall as everybody else was already being seated. And one of those in attendance, a Norwegian woman, became greatly upset by Bion's arrival at the table, despite him being the guest of honor. You see, with his tardy arrival, there were, she exclaimed, a total of 13 diners at the table. Not good news for the religiously superstitious. But in full gaiety, Bion calmed the lady by saying, "No worries, madam. In such a case, it is the last to arrive who pays for all." The meal was no doubt a huge champagne-fueled success, and everyone had a blast. Until 2 weeks later, when on his ship returning to France, Bion died of an unspecified fever and was buried at sea. Whether it was yellow fever or that he was the last to assume his seat at a table of 13, we'll never know. The French really must be credited for large developments in the Panama Canal project, but ultimately they found themselves unable to complete the task that they had negotiated so enthusiastically for. And in an almost perfect geopolitical dovetail, American interest began to heat up again. But more issues were around the corner. This time they weren't tropical diseases or lack of money. They were political. Colombia and America weren't best of friends, but neither were the Colombians and the Panamanians. Remember, at that time, and now we're talking 1902, Colombia ruled Panama, but a popular uprising was gathering momentum. And President Theodore Roosevelt was in the White House at the time, and seeing the opportunity to kill two birds with one stone, covertly supported a Panamanian revolution, which had been engineered by officials from the French Société before the French efforts to construct the canal had dried up. Commentators these days talk a lot about soft power, what can be achieved without the use of direct force. And this is something that predates our contemporary cyber warfare of hack attacks. It even predates the chess game of the Cold War. Subterfuge and covert manipulation date all the way back to biblical times. And Roosevelt's arm's-length intervention at Panama is a fascinating example of geopolitical muscling, or what historians and political commentators sometimes refer to as gunboat diplomacy. An argy-bargy that didn't involve any American shots being fired, but the existence of US warships in the region was enough to secure the Panamanians a much-wanted taste of independence from Colombian rule, and it gave the Americans almost carte blanche in negotiating a staggeringly one-sided deal for America to assume the rights to build the canal from the French, whose deal with the Colombians was no longer worth the paper that it was written on. Two major changes resulted from the change of flag from the tricolor to the Star-Spangled Banner. First, the sea-level pipe dream was out, replaced with a more realistic approach of using locks. The second big change was how the American-led canal mission managed tropical diseases, including the discovery that diseases such as yellow fever and malaria were being spread by mosquitoes. If you control the mozzies, you've already dealt with a huge strain on the workforce undertaking this massive engineering feat. Now, over the next 12 years, the American-led project successfully broke through and connected for the first and still the only time the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans via an artificial waterway. But the French connection wasn't entirely severed, because the very first ship to traverse the canal from end to end was actually French. Alexandre Le Vailly. Now, I have no idea if this is a kind of poetic concession to the instigators of this magnificent project, or maybe it was just coincidental happenstance. But either way, I think that's a nice touch. And if you were thinking that this was going to be the end of geopolitical dramas surrounding the Panama Canal, I'm afraid you're somewhat mistaken. The Panama Canal brings in an average of $2 billion a year. And at the outset, America was taking 100% of all revenues back up north. To put it another way, can you imagine Panama putting up a toll station along the I-95 and charging every vehicle to pass, then taking all of that money out of America and straight back to Panama? Someone in the US Senate would have something to say about that. And as you might imagine, people in Panama were having similar thoughts regarding their canal. But it took a good while to transition the canal from American control to local Panamanian control. 85 years, in fact. Just to put that into some context, according to the OECD, the canal is associated with roughly 40% of economic activity in Panama, with annual revenues representing about 5.4% of GDP. So if Panama had taken 5.4% of US GDP last year, they'd have taken $1.41 trillion back to Panama City with them. If they did that for the next 85 years, forget any idea of economic growth or inflation for a minute, they would pocket a tidy $120.02 trillion. Well, from 1914 to 1979, the USA exclusively controlled the Panama Canal, collecting all toll revenues and bringing them back up north. Well, in 1970, the canal's most successful year so far, toll stations welcomed 15,523 vessels. In 1979, change started to gather steam, and control passed to the Panama Canal Commission, a joint agency, the USA and the Republic of Panama. Now, the 1980s started fairly well for Panama, but following a regional recession in 1982 and General Manuel Noriega's rise to power, the USA was starting to get a little jumpy with its canal bedfellow. Panama was forced to default on its IMF debt in 1987. What followed was a general strike, the shutting of the banking system for 2 months. America's investment in the country's biggest infrastructure project was then looking a little insecure. And unlike Roosevelt's Cold War style of attack on Colombia back at the turn of the century, one of President George H.W. Bush's first acts of international policy in 1989 was to invade Panama and to unseat Noriega. Now, while the era of geographic empires may have passed, the new world of economic empires was in its adolescence, and America sought to protect its geopolitical and economic interests. But times roll on, and the realpolitik moved on too. As the years passed and Panama's economy developed into a middle-income economy, America's interest in the region changed again. And eventually, at 12 p.m. on December the 31st, 1999, complete control was passed to the Republic of Panama, which has governed and operated the canal ever since via the Panama Canal Authority, known locally as the Autoridad del Canal Panama. Surprisingly, despite the roller coaster ride of engineering and political drama that surrounded the conception, creation, and management of this man-made waterway, little has actually changed for the Panama Canal over its 110-12-year period since it opened for trade. Right the way through until the early 2000s, and then a project to build a third set of locks, allowing access for larger vessels, was approved, and those third locks, the Agua Clara locks, were completed in 2016. So if you hear people referring to a ship as a Neo-Panamax ship, that means that that ship can only use the third set of locks. It's too big for the original 2 locks. But we'll cover more about the locks in a moment when we go over the canal's route. Before we do that, I know that was a lot of historical information, so we're going to do a quick 60-second recap after I take a glass of water. This is going to go fast. Should we put the time on the clock? Are you ready? The Spanish were the colonial power in Central America, and they wanted to build a transoceanic canal, but they didn't get round to it. Central America achieved liberation from Spain with no canal in sight. France built the Suez Canal, and they thought, aha, we can do the same in America. They negotiated with the Colombians, who ruled the region at the time, and they gained exclusive rights to build a canal. They wanted a sea-level canal with no locks. Many people died during the construction, and Panama's rock proved much more challenging to move than Egypt's sand. The French project ran out of steam and money, and Panama gained independence from Colombia, so the French exclusivity deal was suddenly meaningless. America, led by President Roosevelt, swooped in, paid the French a parting fee, and completed the canal in August 1914 with locks instead of an ocean-level crossing. America ran the canal exclusively from 1914 to 1979. Then they shared control with Panama until midday of December the 31st, 1999, when they handed over complete control of the canal to the Panamanian government, who have independently operated the canal ever since. Oh, wow. I can take a rest. Okay, no excuses for not knowing all of that. So with that overview of the story that got us to today, let's look at the canal that we're going to be traversing in just a couple of days' time. As you already know, the canal that we're going to be going through is a lock-type interoceanic canal, meaning that whilst it starts and ends at sea level, most of the crossing actually takes place above sea level in artificially constructed channels above the sea level. 40 ships traverse the canal every day with an operation that runs around the clock, 24/7. Monday through Sunday, this canal just keeps going. Generally, cruise ships take the daytime sailing slots so that we can take advantage of the experience, whereas cargo ships will pass through the canal for practical reasons rather than pleasure, may be scheduled for a crossing under cover of darkness. Shore to shore, the Panama Canal covers a length of 40 miles, 65 kilometers, although the true length of the canal is nearer 50 miles, 82 kilometers, once you consider that the deep water channel really starts before the ship ever reaches the shoreline. The journey itself shortens the New York to San Francisco trade route by some 8,000 nautical miles, 15,000 kilometers. So instead of seeing the breathtaking sights of Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Peru. Ships just cut across, all in the span of less than 10 hours. Now, before I zoom in on the map, we're traveling from the Atlantic to the Pacific, east coast to west coast, east to west, right? Well, no. Oddly, in a fun quirk of geography, we start at the eastern mouth of the canal to the west and emerge at the western side of the canal to the east. The eastern entrance of the canal is more westerly than the west coast exit, because this east-west canal isn't really east-west at all. It runs due south from the Atlantic side entrance at Cologne, through the Gatun Locks, through the Gatun Lake, at which point it takes a sharp turn to the east. Then it follows a generally southeasterly course until it reaches the Bay of Panama on the Pacific side of the crossing. So, let's follow an east-northwest to west-southeast crossing of the Panama Canal, and we'll explore the key landmarks as we go. So, entering the Atlantic side, a ship first sails through the protected waters of the Caribbean Sea. They don't feel so protected today, but they're protected. And they enter a 7-mile, 11-kilometer approach channel at Limon Bay. Limon Bay is a natural harbor with no docks, so ships are able to drop anchor as they wait, and they just wait there until their passage through the canal is cleared. If you were to get off the ship here and take a car, you would be in Panama City on the opposite coast within an hour and a half. After sailing along the 7-mile channel from Limon Bay, the ship will arrive at the Gatun Locks. At this point, the ship will be raised 85 feet, 26 meters, from the Caribbean Sea up to the Gatun Lake. And the sheer size of these paired locks is simply staggering. Each lock in this 3-step system is paired with a twin to allow one ship to descend as the other ascends, heading in opposite directions. Now, the twin locks have identical chambers, and they operate with the absolute simplicity of gravity flow. It's genius. It's remarkable to watch. The gates of the locks are controlled with electric motors, which are recessed into the lock walls. They're operated by a control tower that sits between the 2 lock chambers. And after about 10 minutes of filling and emptying, the lock gates are then ready to swing open again and release the captive vessel. And those gates are so monumental and hold back so much water that it takes 2 whole minutes to completely open them before a ship can start moving again. Let's talk about dimensions for a sec. And these numbers aren't really going to mean so much until we actually get there and you see them for yourself. These are monumental locks. This is not your typical quaint canal. Each of the original lock chambers is 1,000 feet long, 110 feet wide, 40 feet deep. The individual leaves of the lock gates are huge in their own right, 65 feet wide, 46 to 82 feet tall, and get this, 6.5 feet thick. The third set of locks, completed in 2016, are even bigger. To put us in the picture, Volendam is the orange, blue is the lock. We are 780 feet long, we are 106 feet and 5 inches wide, and we sit 27 feet 1 inch in the water. There's barely any wriggle room at all on either side. That is less than a meter's clearance. With every rise or fall of the locks, 52 million gallons, 197 million liters of water is displaced. That's 221,928 tons of water. That is almost 4 times heavier than our ship. Now, a collision in the dock chambers would cause significant damage to both the vessel and the canal infrastructure, and so a series of mechanical aids were designed to keep ships and the canal safe. Now, the first I want to show you isn't used anymore. It was called a fender chain. So this was a length of chain that was stretched between the canal walls on the approach. It could forcibly slow down a speeding ship by hooking under the ship's hull and just pulling it back from the lock gates. It was powered by immense hydraulic machinery, but they stopped using that. Anyway, once a ship has slowed to a stop, this will happen when we transit the canal. We'll be connected up to electric towing locomotives known as mullers, which, just like tugboats in a port, can assist a large ship in maneuvering tight and complicated channels. In the case of these mullers, which are really good fun to watch, by the way, they keep our ship centered in position in the lock chamber, and they travel alongside us as we progress through the chambers, chugging along on their railway tracks. All right, so we've climbed 85 feet through these locks. We're now emerging into the Gatun Lake, a massive 166 square mile artificial lake filled with fresh water from the Gatun Dam on the Chagres River. With a channel depth varying from as shallow as 46 feet to as deep as 85 feet, the channel through the lake stretches 23 miles and is one of the most naturally beautiful parts of the journey. And of course, I say naturally in the loosest sense of the word, because this lake is entirely the creation of 19th century engineers. But it looks natural. We exit the lake at Gamboa, which is the beginning of the Culebra Cut, another artificial creation, a valley that slices across the continental divide between North and South America. The cut itself is an 8-mile track with an average depth of 43 feet. And remember, at this point, we're still at our highest point in our journey, sailing 85 feet above sea level. So even though the Culebra Cut is at the highest altitude, it's also the part of the canal that requires the most constant maintenance in the form of dredging, because a mixture of heavy rainfall and unstable soils can result in landslides impeding the canal's passage. Now, only 2 landslides have been sizable enough to result in one-way traffic restrictions, essentially closing the canal to any vessels wanting to cross in the opposite direction, and that was in 1974 and 1986. Hopefully, we won't experience any landslides, but we are likely to see these dredging vessels, which are tasked with keeping the channel clear of build-up and ensuring a safe and efficient crossing for all vessels. So across the continental divide we go, and at the end of our 8-mile journey through the cut, we arrive at the Pedro Miguel locks. This is a single-step lock that lifts or lowers vessels 30 feet from the level of the Gatun Lake to the slightly lower level of the Miraflores Lake, which sits at 52 feet above sea level. Compared to Gatun, Miraflores Lake is pretty small. It allows for just a 1.2-mile channel between the Pedro Miguel locks down to the final set of locks, which are called the Miraflores locks, which will then lower the vessel into the sea level 52 feet back down. Exiting the Miraflores locks, the ship will then continue along a 7-mile approach passage towards the port of Balboa, which marks the Pacific entrance to the canal. And it's from this point that we'll get a fantastic view of the Great Steel Arch Bridge of the Americas, a 5,425-foot long bridge that spans the 2 continents at the Pacific entrance of the Panama Canal. The bridge was actually originally called the Thatcher Ferry Bridge, after the original ferry which crossed the canal prior to the opening of the bridge itself. But despite being commemorated as the Thatcher Ferry Bridge on this commemorative stamp from 1962, the government officially renamed the bridge Bridge of the Americas 10 days before its inauguration. So that stamp is really valuable. For a long time, the Bridge of the Americas was the only bridge that crossed the 40-mile inland length of the Panama Canal. But for us, it will be the 3rd bridge we'll sail under as part of our canal crossing. The first one will be the Atlantic Bridge. That's at the Gatun Locks. It was built by a French construction company, no love lost. and it opened in August of 2019. Then the second bridge that we will cross, which opened in 2004, is the Centennial Bridge. That crosses at the Culebra Cut. On average, once a ship enters the Panama Canal, it takes 10 hours to transit the full distance. We'll do it slightly quicker than that because we are a slightly quicker vessel than the average cargo ship. But a ship like us would expect to pay roughly $283,593 in fees. But I want to finish today's talk with a surprising story of a crossing that took 50 hours over the course of 10 days, but only cost 36 cents. A crossing of legend, but nonetheless entirely true. The lowest toll in the history of the Panama Canal made the American government a measly 36 cents back in August 1928. This is the story of the SS Richard Halliburton. The canal had been in operation for a good 14 years and had captured the attention of a 28-year-old from Brownsville, Tennessee, a travel writer, the son of a civil engineer, fairly short at 5'7", relatively slight at 140 pounds too. Nevertheless, that wasn't going to stop Richard Halliburton swimming the Panama Canal. Now, crossing the Panama Canal as a ship isn't the easiest accomplishment, but swimming the canal with its resident alligators, often unforgiving sun, barracudas, mosquito, and of course not forgetting some rather large ships, was an idea that only certain people would consider. Now, I don't want to ascribe an adjective to those sorts of people, but whatever adjective you've chosen, Richard Halliburton was it. No stranger to danger. Halliburton had already leapt the Mayan Well of Death twice, had piloted a biplane upside down above the Taj Mahal, and had swum the canals of Venice. But he was far from being an Olympic swimmer. He was determined. And just like any other vessel, just like us in a couple of days' time, it took 27 million cubic feet of water to lift the SS Halliburton 85 feet into the Gatun Lake. But his journey was unlike the one we're going to be making in so many ways. To give you a small taste of his experience, here's how he described the experience of swimming away near the Gatun Locks. Out rushed 9 million cubic feet of water down the 500-foot channel, helter-skelter, out into the Atlantic. And I was trying to swim not only upstream, but uphill. For no sooner had the discharge from one lockage swept past, but that another rushed after it. In desperation, we tried clinging to the shoreline where the current was somewhat less severe. But this was tempting the alligators beyond all reason. But I had to take the chance. Swimming, resting, clinging to branches, I struggled inland through the tropical scenery, gaining scarcely half a mile an hour, cursing back at the passengers and crew that waved from the decks of ships, sailing gallantly past. Since I knew that each ship, soon after it saluted me so amiably, would send from the emptying lock chamber another mountain of water against which I must swim. As if the feat of swimming the Panama Canal weren't terrifying enough, the plane carrying his 9,000-word story back home crashed, forcing Richard to write it all over again. And it's a pretty rare find these days, but you can find it if you keep your eyes peeled for a copy of New Worlds to Conquer. New Worlds to Conquer, published in 1929 by Garden City Publishing Company in New York. So whilst I hope that our adventure through the Panama Canal is slightly less thrilling in the terrifying sense of the word than that of the SS Richard Halliburton, perhaps we can indeed connect with his reasons for embarking on such a journey. I'll leave you with a thought from Richard Halliburton. I wanted freedom. Freedom to indulge in whatever caprice struck my fancy. freedom to search in the farthermost corners of the earth for the beautiful, the joyous, the romantic. He only lived a short life. People like Richard Halliburton often only live a short life. But Richard Halliburton lived his dream, and I hope you're living yours too. Thank you.